All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Tejendra Ferali, and I'm Professor of Education, Conflict and Peace at University College London, and I'm Co-Research Director for Education Research in Conflict and Protracted Crisis. Thank you for joining the UCL ERICC seminar series. This series is part of the ERICC research program consortium, and it is particularly designed to promote critical discussions around research and politics of education and theories and conceptual ideas in the field of education, conflict, and peace. So we have other series running which primarily focuses on dissemination of knowledge that is relevant for policymakers, practitioners, and the wider EIE community. But this particular seminar series is to promote academic discussion in the field of education, conflict, and emergencies. So we would very much like you to invite you to share your thoughts and raise critical issues, maybe reflect on your own sort of ongoing work in the field as we engage in discussions as part of this seminar series. I would like to thank INE for facilitating and helping us to host this seminar series. Today, I think this is really timely that we are hosting this event, that the war in Syria has left a trail of destruction, and the country is devastated and fragmented and economically ruined, if you like, and millions of people have been displaced. And approximately 6 million Syrians have been exiled, facing challenges to educational access over the past decade. Schools and educational infrastructure has been destroyed and will take many years to rebuild. So even though the fall of Assad regime and a new political environment presents an opportunity to build new Syria, with an inclusive education system that promotes peace with justice and reconciliation, many Syrian people are yet to be assured that the country will actually take the path of peace and social transformation. So we are here today to discuss these issues, particularly focusing on some of the challenges that we're going to be facing in relation to conducting research in the education sector, with the hope of supporting the educational conversations in terms of rebuilding education system in Syria, which promotes peace and reconciliation. So I'm today joined by three presenters who will be sharing their brief remarks, and we have a discussant who would be sharing his brief remark at the end. Then we hope to have around 25 minutes for a Q&A at the end. So the first speaker, I hope he's able to join, is Rabie Nasser, who is Syria Country Research Director at the ERICC program, and he's also Director of the Syrian Center for Policy Research, based in the University of Vienna. Sorry. The second speaker will be Rania Maalouf. She's a researcher at the Center for Lebanese Studies, and she focuses on migration, displacement, and education, as well as a researcher on the ERICC program. Then we have Dr. Robert Palmer, who is ERICC Country Director for Jordan and Executive Director for Research and Program Development at the Queen Rania Foundation. Finally, we got Dr. Oudai Tozan, who hope he's going to be able to join as well. It was running a bit late, I guess. He's a researcher at the University of Cambridge and researching the potential role of exiled Syrian academics and researchers in rebuilding the higher education sector of Syria. So without further ado, I don't think we've got. My plan was to invite Rabia to speak first, but I don't think we've got Rabia joining yet. But I would be able to invite him as soon as he joins in. Can I invite Maria to give an opening remark, about 7 minutes max, reflecting on the situation in Lebanon, how Syrian refugees are thinking about the prospect of perhaps re-engaging, returning to Syria in order to be part of this new sort of Syria rebuilding campaign, if you like. So, Maria, over to you.
See my screen?
Yes.
So, hello everyone. Today I will discuss with my colleague, also Cathrine Brun, who is joining us, the ongoing challenges Syrian refugee children face in accessing education in Lebanon and what this means for the future within the recent development in Syria. First, when Syrian refugees started arriving in Lebanon in 2011, they came to a country with an economic and school system already struggling. Upon their arrival to Lebanon, Syrian refugee children faced school interruptions, mainly due to delays in implementing educational policies such as Race 1 and Race 2, in addition to bureaucratic barriers to accessing education, such as the residency permits or documents from Syria, and the absence of alternative routes to education. Also, the injustice in Lebanon's educational response towards Syrian refugees can be observed from the early years of arrival in terms of the school segregation, which are the separate afternoon shifts for Syrian students, which were less than a full school day, depriving children from a normal schooling experience and lowering their chances of integrating socially, leading to increased discrimination. In addition to the grade misplacement with respect to age or and ability, the lack of preparatory support despite learning math and science subjects in English or French, and the language difficulties leading to lower schooling performance and retention rates. When it comes to the outcomes, the restrictions on residency permit and work permits increased refugees' vulnerabilities in Lebanon, forcing an increasing number of children, mainly males, to drop out of school to support their families. And according to the SEER 2023 numbers, 61% of school-age refugee children are out of school, and 65% of refugee youth are not in education, training, or employment. And despite all the fundings and efforts invested in the schooling of refugee children, both Race 1 and 2 failed to reach the 60% of enrollment target. In addition to these challenges discussed, the Syrian refugees children in Lebanon have faced exclusions during different times of crisis, such as during the COVID-19 lockdown. Children, particularly those enrolled in afternoon shifts, were given little attention and faced significant exclusion from education, and their access to online learning was severely restricted due to financial barriers, including the inability to afford digital devices and internet access, further deepening existing educational inequities. Furthermore, during the latest Israeli aggression on Lebanon, Syrian refugee students faced further difficulties in accessing education, compounding their existing challenges and further increasing their learning losses. They were excluded from the Ministry of Education's weekly statistics and emergency planning and only included in the later stages of the planning. And on November 21, 2024, the Minister of Education issued a memorandum limiting school enrollment to Syrian refugee students only with a valid residency permit or UNHCR ID. And to note that As per the Vasir numbers, only 20% of all the Syrian refugees who are holding legal residencies in Lebanon, and 80% are lacking these valid residency. And now, what's the situation? With more than 40,000 Syrian students are lacking valid residency, the enrollment figures among them in the afternoon shift has dropped from 156,000 to 112,000 for the recent academic year. And because of the refugee returns to Syria, with more than 350,000 return, has led to a fewer afternoon shift schools and reduced the UNICEF funding. On the other hand, more than 50 local organizations and UNICEF have supported undocumented Syrian children for more than 7 years, helping them access diverse educational environment. Now, how the recent developments in Syria will impact our research, ERICC research, due to the limited focus on Syrian refugees during Israeli aggressions on Lebanon, despite the increasing restrictions on education access. To address this, our research will include a dedicated case study on Syrian refugees, ensuring adequate sample size and representation of marginalized group, and we will explore refugees' perspectives on returning to Syria and their expectations for their children's education, whether in Lebanon or in Syria. And I will conclude my presentation with a few reflections from Syrian refugees gathered during our ongoing fieldwork, offering first-hand insights into their experiences and perspective. For example, one Syrian father told us that he refused returning to Syria because of the recent gloomy situation there. However, a Syrian mother told us that she will return to Syria this summer because she missed her country, but her daughter is unable to enroll in a university in Lebanon due to lack of legal residency. Also, she's feeling now the increasing restrictions on Syrian people recently in Lebanon. And another Syrian mother preferred to stay between Lebanon and Syria, since the education in Lebanon so far for her children is going well and it's much better than in Syria. And thank you so much for your attention.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Maria, for giving that very useful background. And I quite like the last slide where you presented some of the perspectives of Syrian parents in relation to what they are thinking about, in terms of returning to Syria. And I think we will come back to that in terms of the research need and what are the sort of changing political environments in Syria would allow them to make those decisions, and the changing educational sort of situation in Lebanon that it continues to impact on their lives. I think this leads nicely to Rabie, and I would like to invite you to share your remark in terms of how the conversations around return of Syrians back home and continuation of their education, if that happens. And yeah, could you share with us your remark around that before we move to the next speaker, Rabie?
Thank you, Tajendra. Thank you, everyone. And I'm so sorry for this technical problem. I thought the proxy is working, and it appeared that we have some technical problem for that. So I'm sorry for this delay. Now, I want to share with you some reflections on the current situation from knowledge research, knowledge production and research, and also from the challenges on the policy level regarding education in Syria. And I will start by mention the accumulation and legacy of conflict, and which many times in the reconstruction many actors start to, or stakeholders, they start to look at the final picture, which is the, for example, the enrollment in 2024, which is almost 60 to 65% for the basic education. While we have to know that there's 14 years of losing almost half of the children at the age of basic education, they lost their enrollment. So we have for more than 40 millions of years school student that have been lost during the conflict. So this is to start with as an accumulation of the losses. We can associate these losses between the enrollment, the losses of life of children, students, and teachers, the losses of infrastructure, and the huge losses regarding the displacement of the children and teachers and families within the country and outside. And I will mention that on average, there is in the neighboring countries, there is a half of generation also deprived from accessing to education during the conflict. So this is huge responsibilities, create a lot of pressure on any authority and any policy to handle this. And I think research need to address this in a very in-depth understanding and diagnose the situation, not just from technical education point of view, but also from political economy point of view, which will lead me to the second point, which is the key issue, the key dangerous part of the loss of the conflict is political/social impact, because the governance of education start to fuel the conflict. It has been used as a collective punishment for the societies, communities across the conflict and across the borders. The education has been targeted directly or indirectly as a collective punishment, and there is many distortion of the governance by either fueling some ideologies or hate for the others or polarization, or by preventing people from have the similar access, so discrimination in accessing to education based on political, religion, ethnical, regional, class aspects or backgrounds. So with this huge accumulation, and I will focus directly on the challenges now. If we don't have the understanding of education as part of the political and social and economic development, we will end up by having a reconstruction by the World Bank to the schools and some rehabilitation for teachers, without managing to see how the roots of the conflict has been planted in the education and connected with the dynamics within the education system and between the relation between education system and society. I think the research on this part is very difficult, especially when you start the reconstruction. The people tend to forget or try to deny to understand and to diagnose the complications and dynamics of the conflict, and to see the connection, for example, between the lack of education and health, the lack of education and citizenship, the lack of education or the quality of education, the poor quality of education and inequality. So I think the research here need to be very serious in understanding these kind of dynamics. The second point is the expectations. It's very important to establish an inclusive space with the participatory approach to engage as much as the authority can in terms of expertise, societies, to rebuild together, because this huge amount of burden cannot be dealt with loans or with a centralized government. This needs to be a participatory governance with a lot of evidence base. So research is very important, data systems are very important, but engaging with societies is very important. This space needs to be protected. So far, we can see that inclusivity is part of the new governance. We can see also the respect of the connection of education with development, with the vision of the country, with the values. We can see a lot of quick decisions like get rid of excess people in the education sector within 3 to 4 weeks with a quick evaluation. Changing the curricula in very controversial changes in many aspects. I mean, aside from removing any symbols based on or regarding the Assad regime. So this is, as a part of the transformation, need to give space, participatory inclusivity to start to think about this long-term change which affect the lives of the children. Also, understanding how to deal with the people who lost the opportunity. Now they are not children anymore. This is another burden, how to deal with this. And I don't think here loans, for example, or money or investment only will create the solution. We need to have the participatory approach with the communities to create solutions and innovative approach how to deal with these people who lost the chance. The traditional education cannot be the solution in this regard. So how this can be created as an alternative. And the third point is about inequalities. As many people talk about transitional justice, you have to put your trade-offs. If your priority is to bring the schools back, this is one priority. If you think from a technical educational point of view, or bring enough teachers now for the current generation, or you want to have more solidarity. I mean, this is not just zero-sum game. But where is your focus? Do you want to focus on more solidarity within the people, or you want to be efficient in creating more readiness for the education sector?
I think, yeah, that's a great point. I think, Rabie, for the respect of time, I think we can come back to this idea later in the Q&A, but I think it's a very nice way of wrapping up your remark, where you are pointing out that there is a need for participatory and a dialogic process of thinking about the kind of education system that is necessary, rather than making ad hoc decisions where diversity and inclusion should be at the forefront. So I'm going to have to maybe move to the next speaker, I'm afraid. We will come back to this question a bit later, and you will have the opportunity to make your further explanations to your remaining points. So can I actually go to Rob now from Jordan, where a similar sort of situation as in Lebanon, but different sets of challenges, to present his thoughts here. Rob.
Hi, everybody. Just so to give you some quick background on Jordan and the Syrian refugee issue. So a country of 11 million, 1.3 million Syrians in the country, large chunk of the population. Most 90% or so of the Syrians in the country are not in refugee camps. Okay, so they're spread around the cities, mostly in the north and middle of the country. At the beginning of the refugee crisis, the government responded as quickly as it possibly could to open up the public schooling system for refugee students. There were few exemptions, provision of school books, taking on board teachers on temporary contracts, and trying to reduce enrollment requirements for the Syrian students. And most of the students that go to school go to government schools, either single or double shift schools. Obviously, there's challenges. There's challenges in terms of continuity, particularly when it comes to transitions. So transitions from primary to secondary of Syrian refugee students. The dropout rate is quite high, and also problems of transition into vocational training and into higher education as well. And also the reach of non-formal provision is not sufficient. In terms of the quality of education, double shift schooling comes with a lot of its own challenges in terms of resources, infrastructure. the amount of instructional time that students get with this kind of schooling operation. Just a quick word on the aid and financing infrastructure. So back in 2016, there was an agreement called the Jordan Compact, which was between the international community and the government of Jordan. And actually, the compact was very clear on the nature of the burden sharing relationship, right? So in the Jordan Compact, it was very clear that the government was committing to providing educational services, and the international community was committing to pay for this. The very last line of the Jordan Compact is one that people seem to keep forgetting, which is that there was an agreement that the government will be able to implement the response plan, including for education, in proportion to the resources that the international community could provide. So there's a whole bunch of donors in the space. There's 5 different grant modalities that support the Syrian refugee education, in addition to several loans which directly or indirectly or partially support either Syrian refugees or the host communities. And of course, this is money that Jordan has to pay back, right? So this is actually technically a contribution from the government of Jordan. And on that note, I mean, by some estimates, Jordan is actually contributing around 60% of the total cost of hosting Syrian refugee education in the country. Now, so okay, 10 years on from the Jordan Compact, where are things and what's going forward? So while the international community still appears very much committed to the principles of burden sharing, then the facts show that you know the response plan, including for education, has consistently been underfunded every single year since it started, and that means the government is taking on a lot more of the burden than was originally agreed. So looking forwards, so really uncertainty is the buzzword right now. There's so much uncertainty about the numbers that will go back to Syria, when they'll go back, how many will stay, how long those that stay will stay for. For the Syrian refugees in the country, there's uncertainty about what they might return to. Jordan still doesn't have these go and see visas, which other refugee hosting countries have. For the donor countries, there's uncertainty about their own diminishing budgets and what that means in a context of expanding regional and global crises. And of course, the government, there's uncertainty about all of this and more, right? In terms of returnees, so the UNHCR registered refugees, about 5% have returned since December. And there was an intention to return survey done in January, which said that, so 40% of those surveyed said that they intended to return the next 12 months. So this is a big number, big proportion. Whether that proportion will actually really go back or not, we have to wait and see. And of course, a big milestone is going to be the end of the current school year. Even if that 40% go back, 60% are intending to stay in 2026 and beyond. Okay, so what does that mean? So in terms of Jordan's position on durable solutions, then, I mean, there are a couple of statements recently from Jordan's foreign minister, which makes Jordan's position quite clear. Jordan is very committed to upholding its commitments to host refugees, to make the stay in Jordan as dignified as possible. But ultimately, you know, the view is that, you know, Syrian refugees need to return back in a voluntary and safe manner. So in terms of you know, questions around financing and other issues, there's a lot of things which these issues you know, give rise to. So thinking about the international community's continued underfunding, right, what impact will this have on the relationship with the government of Jordan going forwards? Will this lead to reversals in policies going forwards? You know, there's only so much the government can take in terms of being able to finance things in the current burden sharing relationship. What options does the government have going forwards in light of this year-on-year reduction? And where does that leave the principle of burden sharing? Could development partner funding be used in a more efficient way? And does there need to be a new compact You know, I mean, the last Jordan Compact was 2016, 10 years ago, very, very different context. Does there need to be a new kind of political agreement about movement going forward, and you know, to be accompanied by a financing commitment? In terms of type or focus of support, what new pathways for Syrian refugee education exist in Jordan, given that there is this real opportunity now of return, that there's 40% of registered refugees are intending to return? What does that mean for what should happen in Jordan going forwards for those refugees here? Should there be a shift in the type of educational support which is provided to these refugees in Jordan, with a view to easing their transition back? So I think I'll end there. Just wanted to throw out a few questions and looking forward to some discussion. Thanks.
Great. That's wonderful. Thanks, Rob. And I think what is increasingly so is this the unknowable future, as Sarah Dryden Peterson calls, about the future trajectories of refugees in relation to what is happening in Syria now adds another level of complexity and, if you like, more radical uncertainty in terms of the kind of education that would be needed, and perhaps you know, after the fall of the Assad regime, now Syria potentially as one of the partners in conversations about what kind of educational arrangement is possible for refugees who will likely return, or those who actually choose to stay in Jordan. So thanks very much for that remark, really, really helpful. So finally, I would come to Oudai for a sort of critical remark on some of the ideas that have been shared here. And Oudai, you've been involved in research on education in Syria. It would be really interesting to hear from you around what prospects lie ahead in terms of the complex political terrain that Syria is experiencing now, and the potential return of refugees in the coming months and years.
Thank you, Tajendra. Just to confirm, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And just also before I share my reflection, I just want to encourage colleagues to put their questions in the Q&A so that I can later be able to monitor them and answer them. So that's just a very quick thing. So thanks for the panelists for their insightful presentations. And Tajendra, you asked what the prospects. I think it's the question of what the prospects is a very complex question. I don't think we can answer it, or I personally can answer it, but we can try to examine this prospect. We can try to wonder and ask questions about these prospects. So when I was hearing Robert and Maria about the return of refugees, I was thinking of the socioeconomic and political factors in both the host and Syria that will impact their return. Are they going to face a new uprooting after they built for 13 years a new life there? Where they will be going back to their homes that have been destroyed, to their cities that have been changed, to their social network that has been dismantled. So there's a question of uprooting there. That's part of the prospects that we need to be prepared for. And what system in place for them in Syria that corresponds to their new reality and their new lived experience as returnee to their home country. What about the social dynamics when they return to Syria? Are we going to have a new hierarchy and politics of belonging between those who stayed and those who left, between those who are refugees and returnee and those who are not? So how the social dynamic will respond to this new reality, the reality of returnee to Syria. So this is more about the socio-political and economic factors. But when I focus and zoom in on their education, Rabie mentioned a lot about the logistical barriers or the difficulties in the education system and how that will impact their return to Syria. Are there any legal barriers coming from a different education system? Some of them might have documents, some of them might not have documents. So there are all of these questions about their return. And here I will focus more on Syria to link with what Rabia was speaking about. Syria, we have this governance problem in Syria. We have a fragmentation, different de facto authorities, different governance, different curricula. So we have a problem of governance that in Syria we need to be considering and thinking of, that could not only support refugees in their return, but also the Syrian communities who lost their chances for education. We have a problem of funding, a big problem of funding. And this is also will impact the prospect. There's a problem of a human capacity, shortage of teachers, for example. That we might have return of teacher refugees from Jordan and Lebanon. That might help to fill the gaps in the education system. But we have this human capacity of managing the education system. All experts, or a lot of them, have left. Situation in Syria, on people of Syria, they still have strong expertise from the lived experience of being in a conflict. But there is still this human capacity thing to consider. And there's the question of higher education, which is missing right now from this conversation. I understand it might be out of scope, but we need to consider what about the role of higher education? How the higher education can support building human capacity that can take local, genuine ownership of the post-recovery process rather than counting on external actors and external experts. So there's this question, and all of that we need to think of it of the global political dynamics that we're having right now. We have a Trump era where we have U.S. aid removing their funding from very needed society, marginalized societies. And that is pushing a lot of government. We're seeing them withdrawing and giving up on their commitments to international development. So we have these big questions and about aid, about the politicization of aid, about the donors' fragmentation and different red lines in Syria, how that will impact the recovery of the education system, the sanctions, a big topic right now we're struggling from in Syria. So all of these big questions, they impact the prospect, and that's why I can't predict, but I can think of all of these factors that we need to think of. I'll stop here to leave as much room for Q&A, and I hope these kind of things also could spark the conversation. So Tajandra, I think me and you, we need to facilitate the Q&A. Please lead, and I'll jump in and support you as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks very much, Oudai. I think those are very interesting and very powerful critical questions that we should be engaging in. Thanks for that remark. And I think you know, it's about the future, isn't it? So what the future is being imagined, but it is not clear, and it's very complex. And how do we address different aspirations, particularly the fragmentation of education across Syria, as well as the refugees who are living in different countries in the neighborhood, being you know, accessing different forms of education or not, and how do we reconcile that, and how that is accounted for in the new conversation about rebuilding Syrian education system. That seems to be the kind of a focus of attention of all Syrians who are living outside or have been internally displaced. About 7 million Syrians have been internally displaced, and also many of them who would want to go back to have nothing to go back to, right? So that's another kind of massive challenge. So to just assume that the dictatorship has fallen and therefore refugees would return home is a kind of a pipe dream that might be affecting the kinds of policies that host countries might be adopting. So that's wonderful. So I'll just open up for Q&A. We've received a number of questions from participants here. We also have Cathrine from if we could give Cathrine access to the panelist, please, who would be joining with Maria to respond to any questions related to Lebanon. So we got a question for Maria. What is, in your opinion, is the priority for education provision? Is it improving access to education programs, formal and non-formal, in Lebanon? or should the focus be on Syria now? So that's the first question to Maria. If Cathrine can join in, she could also respond as necessary.
Thank you so much for this interesting question, and I will answer on behalf of myself and my colleague Cathrine as well. So it's we think that it will be a long process, and it will take a long time for Syrian refugees to return. So while we need to think of how to prepare for return, it's also very important to keep the focus on the need to continue to work for access and quality for Syrian children in Lebanon to education. Also, if we want to highlight the teachers' case, they have not been able to teach in Lebanon, so more emphasis on how to prepare Syrian teachers in Lebanon for teaching as well. But very important not to forced return.
Great. And I think there's another relevant question here. I believe, Maria, you presented the plan for conducting research in relation to what are the perspectives of Syrian refugees in Lebanon in terms of their return. But there's a question around, did the research include any figures on the percentage of intentions to return? Anything that you want to share? Maybe you don't have the percentage, but any more deep insights you can share around what do you think is the level of sort of intentions among the Syrian refugees to return to Syria?
Yeah, thank you as well for this question. So far, we are doing qualitative interviews, so we don't have numbers, and but in general, if we want to talk generally, and I can compare the ongoing fieldwork now with the previous fieldwork that we did in year 2020, 2021 for a previous project, that we can see so far with the little now interviews we already gathered, that the perspectives for return are a little bit changing. But as Oudai said and highlighted, there are lots of factors that Syrian refugees are taking into consideration to think about the return or not.
Okay, great. Cathrine, would you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's all good. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks very much. And I think there's a question to, I guess, Rabie or Oudai or everyone around the new curriculum. That is it too early to grasp the kinds of changes that are happening in the curriculum? And I know that there were some contestations around the removal of some of the signs and symbols that refer to the previous regime, but it wasn't necessarily done through a consultative process. Any insights that you could share, Oudai and Rabie?
Of course, and Rabie, feel free to also step in. So basically, one of the things I worked with Rabie in the past month is we downloaded all curriculums. We downloaded all changes. We looked at them one by one, and we tried to understand the discourse that it's supporting, and we tried to understand what that means to the Syrian society from an angle of social justice and peace and so on. And I have some brief to share, but I think the topic of curriculum, it's a big topic that maybe I'll share the report later for those who want to really understand the nuances of it. But there is some observations. One of them, that there's a trend towards there's a political discourse that being served, and this political discourse linked to removing Assad things, and this is not controversial. Everyone in the Syrian context agree with this, but there's a political discourse that people felt not happy with, that there's a denial of the previous Ottoman Empire crimes in Syria that has been seen as using education for political purposes to not have any issues with Turkey, with that political dynamic. So we have this political kind of discourse. We have a political discourse related to deleting things related to Arab unity and nationalism and the Palestinian resistance. But these things were linked to Assad narrative as well. but at the same time, they have been taken from the curriculum. Now, there's a religious discourse that being used. There's more towards using Islamic interpretation of certain things. So some people have thought that, that the new government is taking female figures out, and there's also that gender dynamic. And I don't think we found this. There was an attempt to remove a historic figure, a female, from the religious curriculum because she has nothing to do with the religion book. So we have also these kind of things, but there are also a move towards using Islamic ways of thinking and being and reflect this in the curriculum. For example, the evolution theory. Everything about the evolution theory has been taken from the science. We have some poetry that could be considered not very much not a poetry that could be problematic in certain interpretations of Islam. So that also has been taken. Anyway, what I'm trying to say, this is a very complicated topic, and I'm happy to share with Rabia later on the full report. And maybe Rabia can touch very briefly, not on the content, but on the process of how this curriculum change happened and why this led to a backlash in the society.
Yeah, Rabia, would you like to briefly comment on that? But also we've got a couple of questions for you around how the World Bank might cooperate with the political context and technical needs of educational reform in promoting inclusivity, but also what are the capacities that the education system is needed to transform the kind of situation that you described?
Yeah, thank you, Tejendra, and for all questions and Oudai. I will come back to what I mentioned as a new inclusive approach or a space, because I think it's very important to start an inclusive way to gain social support for the new authority, because now there is a lot of, optimistic about the fall of Assad regime, which I think all the Syrians see it as a historical moment for all of us. However, if the way of doing or conducting the authority will continue in this way, this will make the people, losing their faith in this. So the trust in the institutions, I would say, is the crucial for the curriculum and for rebuilding the education sector. And this will engage a lot of people to support from civil society, private sector, and of course the public sector. Otherwise, it will be, you will lose the people support, the work as with the people with passion to rebuild the country and to rebuild the sector. And linking this to the other concerns of the people in terms of their citizenship, with their solidarity, their countering the conflict dynamics, I think this is crucial for all of us. So I think before we look for the World Bank views, like how to rebuild the schools, or how we have a very intense rehabilitation for the teachers, I think we need to see how the governance can be more inclusive. This needs a change from all the actors in Syria to the authorities, because if we don't have this pressure from the communities and from the student and from other stakeholders who are interested in more inclusive education system, I think the authority can continue in the current way. The current way, just few comments on this, like the decision that we will get rid of the excess employees. They did that in 3 to 4 weeks. In the education sector, we have more than 200,000 employees. So this is, they have a rush to make it a slim government, while we need a huge labor force to rebuild the country.
Yeah.
The way that they deal with the decision of curricula, or the way they deal with the employees, I think it's not giving trust for the people how they deal with that. Their experience in Idlib as well, they give a lot of space for the civil society and the private sector, which I think this will create a lot of inequalities in the future.
Okay, thanks very much, Rabia, for that. Can I pose a question to Rob? And I've got a question from Sarah here. And she's asking about whether there has been any conversation regarding the potential of Jordan hosting people or those who will potentially be expelled from their homes in Gaza, and what would be its impact?
So the answer is no. I mean, Jordan's foreign minister, Ayman Safadi, has made Jordan's position very clear, that Palestinians cannot be transferred to Egypt, Jordan, or any other Arab state. So there isn't a discussion on that right now.
Great, that's very helpful. Thanks very much. There's also another question which, Rob, you might want to comment on around. So who are the potential donors to restart education in Syria, do you think? I know that it's not focused on Jordan, but are you able to give any insights in terms of which members of the international community chip in to support the educational rebuilding process in Syria?
Probably my colleagues will be better positioned to answer that, but I noticed there was another question in the comment about what will happen to Syrians who remain in Jordan if the funds continue to drop. And this is really interesting. I mean, the funds have been dropping since the Jordan Compact was first agreed 10 years ago. Jordan has not reneged on its pledge to support Syrian refugees in the country, and I can't imagine it would do so. The question becomes, how fair is it on Jordan going forwards if it increasingly takes on an increasing burden for this? You know, Jordan, as we all know, is not a rich country. In fact, it was the only country in the world in 2023 to be downgraded from an upper to a low middle income country, primarily because of the increased population in the country. So Jordan is under a lot of stress. It has been under a lot of stress for the last 10 years. And going forwards, there'd be big question marks around what burden sharing actually means if the international community was to continue to drop their support if Syrians are going to stay in Jordan in large numbers.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much. So I've got a couple of other questions for Oudai. You might want to briefly respond to. How Syrian society can respond to cutting of foreign aid. So how is the human capacity how can the human capacity be sustained in this situation? Would you like to comment on that? I think this refers to the aid cuts from the US administration.
Sure. Just to briefly explain that, my understanding that US aid funding in Syria is limited to the northeast. The northwest is not where US aid are active, and the southern part of the country. So we're talking about maybe 15% of the population, 20% where that US aid cut will impact. Now, how would the northeast or the autonomous administration, the Kurdish authority there, how would they fill this gap? And so one, we don't know if the aid cut is completed and finalized, and it's now on pause. So we're not sure still how this is going, but let's be pessimistic and say it's happening. That part of the country is right now having negotiations and agreement to become part of the whole of Syria. So we can have a whole of Syria. And then this will become like a Syrian kind of wider problem rather than just northeast problem. But that side, I think it can count on one. There, it's a rich, rich resource, rich part of the country, rich region with the mineral and the petroleum. So it's a rich region. But also, I believe for the future of Syria, one of the biggest sources that should step in, which is the diaspora. The Syrian diaspora, with the expertise, with the human capacity, with the funding. This is what we should be counting on, not international aid. Later on, other governments might stop the international aid. So how can we, I believe this is a big question for the government, and in their discourse, from the biggest figure to the lowest, they are saying our main capital is our human resources. So they are aware of this. The question is how they can translate this narrative into an action, how they can facilitate bridges between diaspora and locals, how they can facilitate bridges between organizations and diaspora. So this is the big question, I think, that could fill some of the gaps.
Great. It's wonderful. So thanks very much. So we got about 3 minutes, and I want to give 1 minute or even less to the panelists to respond to my final question, which is about many of you have been researching into education in your own context relating to the Syrian refugee situation. After the fall of this Assad regime, how does your research get impacted in relation to the focus of the inquiry as well as the methodological approach that you have planned? Could you reflect on what kind of changes in educational research is needed when there is a sudden shift of politics and political situation in the context where you are focusing on? I'll open it by asking Cathrine to reflect, maybe. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Thanks. I wasn't prepared for that, but and Maria, do chip in. But I guess for the work we're doing in Lebanon, obviously what's happening is changing the future lens for many of the people we are working with in the Syrian community. You know, I think there's a different kind of uncertainty, and perhaps there's a different scale to the way that people think about futures, the immediate, the medium term, and long term. And I think this is really impacting education in the way that people think about the investment in their children at the moment. So I think that's extremely important. But on the other hand, I would also say that it really impacts on governance. Lebanon has had a very hostile environment towards Syrian refugees. And I think it becomes even more important to really center some of the education experiences in thinking about these different types of futures or scenarios for refugees. So I think that's perhaps, I don't know, Maria, if you want to say something else, but I think for us that is something that we are.
I think that's enough from Lebanon for now. So thanks very much. Yeah. Rob, very briefly, very literally 20 seconds.
Yeah, and obviously it's a change in the wider context, right? So one of the studies we're looking at this coming year is looking at different types of social risks that students face, and so when it comes to Syrian refugees, then there's a number of different factors which are preventing them from going back home, even if they want to, right? So in terms of economic, like debt, which the families have, in terms of paperwork and all sorts of other things. So there's that, and plus the funding issue is huge. You know, as funding starts ramping up for Syria reconstruction, what impact that might have on neighboring countries that are still hosting large numbers of Syrians?
Yeah, thank you very much. Rabie, literally 1 sentence, please.
There is more space for research, and the dynamic of change of policies create more potential influence from research on policy, and there is more engagement with the society. I hope this space will continue with the whole uncertainty that we have. But I think this is 2 points are the major one.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Oudai?
Very briefly, my previous research was always about analyzing the past, analyzing how Assad controlled and co-opted and used education and weaponized education. And now, but I can dream, I can aspire to think of the future, because now there is a future. So all of my research now is shifted to focus on the future, on recovery, on reform, on peace building, and how that could look like in the Syrian context.
That's wonderful. Thank you, colleagues, for very insightful presentations and discussion. Thank you, everyone, for joining the seminar and sending your questions. I'm afraid I was not able to take every question that was posed, but hopefully we can carry on conversations. Please do email our panelists if you've got further questions. And we look forward to seeing you in the next seminar. I would like to thank INE and all the colleagues, Hiba Salem, who has helped coordinate this seminar, Ariane Ayun and Syria and Sarah from INE for supporting this event. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye, everyone.